In 1970, in a suburb outside Los Angeles, a social worker walked into a small, dark room and found a 13-year-old girl who had never spoken a single word in her life. Not because she couldn't, because no one had ever given her the chance. She had spent nearly her entire childhood confined, isolated, silent. What happened to her mind in that room would go on to answer one of the biggest questions in all of human psychology. Is language something you're simply born with, or is it a door that only stays open for a while, and then quietly, permanently closes? Start with what should be obvious. Every healthy human child on earth learns to speak. Not taught, exactly, the way you're taught arithmetic or history. Absorbed. A child surrounded by language soaks it up almost automatically, stringing together grammar rules no one explicitly explained, forming sentences they've never heard before. It looks effortless. It looks inevitable. So researchers have long asked a difficult question. What happens if a child grows up without that exposure at all? Not a child born with a disability. A child born with a fully capable brain, simply denied the input every other human child receives by default. The case from 1970 became known in psychological research by the pseudonym Jeannie, used to protect her identity. She had been kept in near total isolation from infancy, with almost no exposure to spoken language, no social interaction, and severely limited physical movement. When she was finally discovered, researchers saw an extraordinary and painful opportunity. Could a 13-year-old brain, otherwise healthy, still learn language from scratch the way a toddler does? The results were remarkable and deeply unsettling. Jeannie began learning words. She built a vocabulary. She could name objects, request things, understand meaning. But grammar, the invisible architecture that lets you combine words into infinitely varied, rule-governed sentences, never fully developed. She could say individual words. She struggled for the rest of her life to reliably string them into the kind of structured sentences that come effortlessly to a 5-year-old. Something about the window for that particular kind of learning appeared to have already begun closing. This idea has a name in linguistics. The linguist Eric Lenneberg proposed what's now called the critical period hypothesis, arguing that there's a specific developmental window, roughly from infancy through puberty, during which the human brain is uniquely primed to acquire language with native fluency. Miss that window entirely, Lenneberg argued, and full grammatical language may never be fully accessible again, no matter how intelligent the person is or how hard they try afterward. Doesn't that sound almost too specific to be true? A door that opens automatically at birth and quietly starts closing years before you're even old enough to understand what you might be losing. Jeannie wasn't the first documented case like this. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, in the forests of southern France, hunters captured a boy who had apparently been living alone in the wild for years. He walked on all fours some of the time. He showed no understanding of human speech. He was brought to Paris and studied intensively by a physician named Jean Itard, who devoted years to trying to teach him language and socialization. The boy, later named Victor, made real progress in some areas. He learned to recognize objects, follow simple routines, form some attachment to the people caring for him. But like Jeannie more than a century and a half later, Victor never developed fluent spoken language. 2 children, separated by nearly 200 years, isolated for entirely different reasons, and yet strikingly similar limits appeared in what their brains could eventually recover. Here's the question worth sitting with. What does it say about human nature that language, something that feels as natural and automatic as breathing, actually depends entirely on a narrow window of experience early in life? You didn't choose to learn your native language. You didn't work hard for it the way you might work hard at a skill later on. It simply happened to you because your brain was exposed to the right input during exactly the right stretch of time. Jeannie's case suggests that if that window closes without the right exposure, no amount of intelligence, effort, or later teaching can fully reopen it. This tells you something important about what actually makes a mind human. It's tempting to think of human cognition as something fixed, something coded entirely into your genes from the moment you're conceived. But cases like Jeannie and Victor reveal something stranger. Your brain arrives with enormous potential, but that potential requires the right environment at the right time to actually become the specific human mind you now have. Strip away that environment during a critical window, and certain capacities simply never fully switch on, even though the underlying biological hardware was there the whole time. Think about how differently this played out for other children raised in extreme isolation, some documented by researchers, some known through less formal historical accounts accounts of children found living among animals or alone in remote conditions. The details differ, the specific limitations differ, but a pattern repeats. Early social and linguistic deprivation, if severe and prolonged enough, produces effects that later intervention can improve, but rarely fully reverses. It's as if the human brain is constantly asking a silent question throughout early childhood. Is language here? Is connection here? And it only stays open to fully answering yes for a limited amount of time. Now, turn that question back toward your own life. Even though you almost certainly grew up with language all around you, every skill you've ever tried to learn as an adult, a new language, an instrument, a sport, probably felt slower, harder, more effortful than it would have if you'd started as a small child. Researchers studying second language acquisition have found that people who begin learning a new language in early childhood are far more likely to achieve native-like fluency, particularly in pronunciation, than those who start as adults. You're not imagining that learning gets harder with age in certain specific domains. Jeannie's case sits at the most extreme, most tragic end of a spectrum that touches your own experience of learning in smaller, gentler ways every day. There's something almost humbling in this. The parts of your mind you take most for granted, the ability to speak fluently, to understand grammar without thinking about it, to form complex sentences without effort, aren't guaranteed outcomes of simply being human. They're the result of a narrow, mostly invisible window of opportunity that opened when you were an infant and quietly, gradually closed years before you have any memory of it happening. You didn't earn this. You inherited it from an environment that happened to give you exactly what your brain needed at exactly the moment it needed it most. So think again about that room outside Los Angeles in 1970. And the girl who stepped out of it into a world made almost entirely of language she could never fully claim. Her case wasn't just a tragedy, though it was certainly that. It became one of the clearest windows science has ever had into what makes a human mind human in the first place. Not just a brain, not just potential, a brain given the right world at exactly the right time before that window ever knew it was closing.